Today, as you can tell from the banner, we celebrate Epiphany because Christmas is finally over. And I know that because Janet took the Christmas tree down yesterday and she deflated my inflatable Santa in the front yard, the one in the board shorts and sunglasses with a flamingo floaty and a little drink and a pineapple with a parasol on it. Actually, technically, Christmas was over yesterday, the 12th day of the Christmas season. Or, if you're in some Orthodox churches, Christmas actually began yesterday. So, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. But for us, as we celebrate Epiphany, or the manifestation of the coming of Jesus as the light of the world, we also read of the second set of visitors to the Christ child. In the Gospel of Luke, we hear that on the night of Jesus' birth, the visitors were local shepherds who came as a result of a spectacularly noisy pronouncement by a chorus of angels. But in Matthew's Gospel, we learn of the later, majestic visitors, and the Gospel speaks of magi, wise ones from the east, who brought gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And you may have noticed that in the reading of from Matthew, I included the account of King Herod trying to kill the baby Jesus by slaughtering all the boy babies in and around Bethlehem. Now, sometimes on this Sunday in the church year, we commemorate that horrific event known as the slaughter of the innocents. But we don't do that very often because it's a horrific story, and it's kind of jarring, coming as it does right after all the beautiful Christmas stories, all the babe in the manger and the angels and the shepherds and the wise ones. And understandably, the slaughter of the innocents does not get preached a lot. Now, yesterday, January 6th, was also 3 years since there was this awful attack on the U.S. Capitol. And as a transplanted American, that's something that's been on my mind a bit yesterday. Now, 3 years ago, when I preached on Epiphany, I had already finished my sermon. And then that happened, and I had to change everything up, because it's often been said that a preacher should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper headlines in the other. And that year, I chose to see some parallels between what was happening in the headlines and what had happened in the biblical account of the wise men and King Herod. You know, the story of an elderly king who is desperate to keep power, who stirred up his city, who lied to everyone about his culpability, who finally saw nothing wrong with flying into a murderous rage and he didn't get his way. You know, sometimes these things just write themselves. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. A minister friend of mine posted on Facebook yesterday that today is January 6th, Epiphany, a day about the inclusion of outsiders, Gentiles, into the faith, and a day that affirmed the love of God, not only for a chosen special group, but truly for everyone. And then he concluded, I hate that this date will always be remembered because of one evil man. And I think he was probably talking about Trump. But I think, sadly, Epiphany is also remembered because of another evil man, Herod. And it is, you know, it's hard as a minister to explain the account of the slaughter of innocents, to even acknowledge that that's in the Bible. But today, I think it's still timely because it shows the horrific lengths that some people will resort to in order to hold on to a little bit of power. And power is often not worth the price that gets paid for it, because power is kind of illusory and transitory and fragile. And that's a fact that is often lost on the people seeking it. Where's Herod today? Anybody? He's dust in the ground. That's where he is. And he caused a lot of people a lot of pain and suffering. But in the end, he died. He died a death that the ancient Jewish historian Josephus described as particularly painful and grotesque. Sorry, not sorry. And if you look at history, you find that often that's what happens to despots. You know, bless me, I never thought a university degree in history would ever be much use, practically speaking, but in troubled times, it is very useful to be able to look at the past and cry out in the words of the old hymn, "Oh, where are kings and empires now of old that went and came? But Lord, your church is praying yet 1,000 years the same." They're all gone. We're still here. Mahatma Gandhi said it best, I think. He said, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall." Think of it. Always. And that actually gives me a little comfort. Now, sadly, I suspect it was no comfort to the thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who suffered under Herod's misrule. But in the end, he fell. And I'm sorry, this is getting depressing, right? Shouldn't I be preaching some nice uplifting sermon about the beginning of the new year, the new start, new possibilities? You can think on that on your own. And yet, this too is part of the Christmas story, which is both divine and beautiful, as well as human and sometimes ugly. Nadia Bolz-Weber is a wonderful theologian, and she writes, "But the Epiphany story of Herod and infanticide reveals a God who has entered our world as it actually exists, not as the world we often wish it would be. God's love is too pure to enter a world that does not exist, even though this is often how we treat Jesus, like we're trying to shelter him from reality. We often behave as though Jesus is only interested in saving and loving a romanticized version of ourselves, an idealized version of our mess of a world. And so we try to offer him a version of our best selves with our Sunday school shoes on. We sing songs about kings and drummers at his birth. So perhaps we can escape the Herod in ourselves and in the world around us. God did not enter the world of our nostalgic silent night, snow-blanketed peace on earth, suspended reality of Christmas. God slipped into the vulnerability of humanity and entered our violent and disturbing world. We need to acknowledge that. In other words, if we just use our faith as a place to escape the difficult realities of our lives, then we've kind of lost the plot. Spirituality should be the place where those difficult realities are given meaning. And we live in a world of very difficult realities. Can I get an amen? Amen. Yeah, you had noticed. If we'd perchance forgotten that for a moment, we only have to look at the headlines for a very hard reminder. Look at Israel and Gaza. Look at Ukraine. The quest for power is destroying lives. It's causing untold suffering. The historian Lord Acton famously said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And I kind of can't really argue with that. And in fact, I might go further and suggest that power corrupts because it erodes empathy. It can make us cruel and heartless. And when we look at the headlines of the past year, we see many people who crave power behaving in the most corrupt, heartless, evil, despicable ways possible. And I don't want an amen for that, but it is so true. How do we embody power? I think when we look at what is going on in the world, we see people embodying power through abuse and megalomania, through violence, through force and fraud and deception and other aggressive means to intimidate and silence opposition and to destroy lives and communities, even nations, even peoples. And there are people who think that this criminal pathway is in fact just the way of the world, and they try to justify their behavior. The ends justify the means, except they don't. They don't. Now, power in and of itself is a dangerous thing, but it's not in and of itself an evil thing. And there is another way for us humans to embody power, and it's the way of the Christ child. And that may sound sappy and naive and completely unrealistic. It also sounds hard. It's simple, but it's hard to do. And yet, I fear it's the only way. Love one another and do justice. Because I have said it before, and I will say it again, justice is what love looks like in public. And I've said that so often, I began to wonder where I got that notion, and so I looked it up. Apparently, Cornel West said it first. He also said, you can't lead people if you don't love the people, and you can't save the people if you don't serve the people. In other words, power is only really effective in the great grand scheme of things if it is exercised in the service of love. Real power, enduring power, is the power that continually cultivates empathy and connection. It is mutual power, shared power that creates accountability and prevents corruption. Mutual empowerment comes from a focus on others, as Jesus taught, to serve one another. And embodying and nurturing that kind of power alleviates suffering and creates the conditions for peace. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And that is so true that I'm going to repeat it. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And the violence that we see in this world is ultimately a failure of love. Well, it's a failure of a lot of things, I guess. It's failure of diplomacy, failure of education, failure of decent, polite upbringing, failure of figuring out the logical consequences of arming people who hate each other. But the heart of it, I truly believe, is a failure of love. And love needs to take up its power by loving our neighbor as ourselves. And when we love our neighbor as ourselves, we cultivate empathy around us. We walk in others' shoes. We feel their pain. And people grant trust and influence and power to individuals who show empathy for them. Love really does have power, and we need to use it. We head into 2024, I think, with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, which I suspect are the same feelings the Magi had when they began their hard journey following a star. And we carry with us into the new year the grief and pain of the last year, but we tilt our faces toward the light of that star and hope. And as we start this new year, one of my prayers for myself and for all of us is that we will find a way, with God's help, to unleash the power of love in our lives and in our world. Amen.